There's a street in Houston, Texas, that most people drive past without a second thought. No fancy storefronts. No neon signs. Just a row of small businesses squeezed between a laundromat and a tire shop, each one holding on by a thread, each one belonging to someone who refused to quit. On that street, tucked between a faded awning and a hand-painted sign that read, Miller's Oven, a light came on every morning at 4:30. Before the sun. Before the city woke up. Before the coffee shops opened their doors to the kind of people who'd never had to worry about next month's rent. That light belonged to Robert Miller. And for 20 years, Robert Miller had been the kind of man who didn't talk much about his struggles. He showed up. He tied his apron. He turned on the oven. And he baked. Robert wasn't a trained pastry chef. He hadn't gone to culinary school or watched cooking tutorials online. He'd learned from his own mother, standing on a step stool in a small kitchen in East Texas, watching her hands move through flour like she was doing something sacred. She told him once, and he never forgot it. She said, "Robert, people don't just eat food. They eat the feeling that comes with it." He carried that lesson into every batch of biscuits he ever made. Miller's oven wasn't a big operation. It was a narrow space, maybe 400 square feet, with 2 ovens, a glass display case, a small register, and a handwritten menu taped to the wall. The menu hadn't changed in 12 years. Buttermilk biscuits, cinnamon rusk, honey rolls on weekends, a few seasonal items around the holidays. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Robert's son, Ethan, had grown up in that bakery the way most kids grow up on playgrounds. He'd done his homework on the flour-dusted counter. He'd fallen asleep in the storage room during slow afternoons. He'd learned to count money before he learned long division, because his father had shown him how to balance the register at the end of each shift. By the time Ethan was 20 years old, he knew every recipe by heart. He knew which oven ran hot. He knew which supplier gave them the best price on butter. He knew the names of the regulars. Miss Clara, who came every Tuesday for a dozen biscuits, old Mr. Petrov, who always asked for extra cinnamon on his rusk, the construction crew from 3 blocks down who stopped in every Friday morning before their shift. He also knew something that he tried not to think about too hard. The bakery was barely making it. Not failing. But not thriving either. Just surviving, the way a lot of working-class families survive in America. Month to month. Paycheck to paycheck. Praying nothing breaks because there's no cushion for emergencies. No savings account with room to breathe. Just the steady, exhausting discipline of keeping the lights on and the ovens running and the family together. Ethan had started community college the previous year. Business administration. He had this quiet, stubborn dream of learning enough to actually help his father, maybe modernize things a little, bring in some new customers, figure out a way to grow what Robert had built. He wasn't flashy about it. He didn't talk about it much. But he thought about it every morning when he helped open the shop before class, and every night when he helped close before studying. His mother, Patricia, worked part-time at a dry cleaner 2 neighborhoods over. Between her income and the bakery, they kept the household running. It was tight. Everything was always a little tight. But there was warmth in that house that money couldn't explain. There was love in that kitchen that didn't need a price tag. That was the life they had built. And then, on a Tuesday in October, everything changed. Robert had a delivery to make. A church 2 miles away had ordered 3 dozen biscuits and 2 trays of cinnamon rusk for their Wednesday morning breakfast program. It was a standing order, one of the few reliable ones they had. Robert loaded the boxes onto the back of his old bicycle, the one with the wire basket he'd had for almost 8 years, and set off. He never made it to the church. A car ran a red light at the intersection of Emory and 5th. Robert swerved to avoid it, hit the curb, and went down hard on his left side. The boxes scattered across the road. The bike twisted under him. And Robert lay on the pavement for a few seconds that felt like much longer, staring up at the gray October sky, knowing before anyone told him that something was seriously wrong. His arm was broken. The radius clean through. The kind of fracture that needed surgery and 6 to 8 weeks of recovery, minimum. He was 53 years old. And he was the only one who knew how to run the bakery. The next few days were a blur that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. The hospital. The surgery. The doctor explaining the recovery timeline in a calm, clinical voice while Ethan's mother sat in the plastic chair beside the bed holding Robert's good hand and trying not to cry in front of her husband. They came home to a bakery that had to stay closed. Closed meant no income. No income meant the bills would start stacking up within weeks. The rent on the bakery space, the home mortgage, the utilities, the supplier invoices that were already due. Ethan sat at the kitchen table that night with a notebook and a calculator and tried to put the numbers together. He sat there for a long time. Then he made a decision. He withdrew from college the next morning. Not because he wanted to. Not because he had given up on his dream. But because the family needed him right now, today, more than his future needed him in a classroom. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would go back. But standing in that bakery alone at 4:30 in the morning 2 days later, tying his father's apron around his own waist for the first time, trying to remember the exact temperature for the first biscuit batch, he felt something shift inside him that was hard to name. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. The weight of being responsible for people you love. The specific kind of pressure that comes when there is no backup plan, no safety net, no one else to call. He turned on the ovens. He started mixing. And Miller's oven opened its doors again. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with working hard and watching it not be enough. It's not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It's the loneliness of standing in the middle of everything you've built, giving it everything you have, and still feeling it slip through your fingers like flour in the wind. Ethan learned that feeling fast. The first week back open, things seemed okay. A few of the regulars came by. Miss Clara showed up on Tuesday, same as always, and she hugged Ethan at the counter and told him his father was a good man and that she'd be praying for the family. The construction crew came on Friday. Mr. Petrov came in for his cinnamon rusk and left a $5 tip, which he had never done before in 12 years of being a customer. It was enough to keep the lights on for that week. Barely. But Ethan noticed something during those first days back. Something he didn't want to acknowledge right away because acknowledging it meant dealing with it. The foot traffic was different. Not just a little different. Noticeably, measurably, painfully different. The casual walk-ins, the people who used to stop in just because they were passing by, because the smell of warm biscuits pulled them off the sidewalk, those people weren't coming anymore. At first Ethan told himself it was because the bakery had been closed for almost 2 weeks. People had found other routines. They'd adjusted. Once word got out that Miller's oven was open again, they'd come back. But they didn't come back. And it wasn't long before Ethan understood why. 3 blocks down, on the corner of a newly renovated stretch of the neighborhood, a bakery had opened while Miller's oven was dark. It was called Sunrise Bakes. It had exposed brick walls and pendant lighting and a menu written on a chalkboard in elegant handwriting. It had a loyalty app. It had a professional Instagram account with beautiful photographs of croissants and artisan loaves and seasonal lattes. It had parking. It had a drive-through window. It had everything that Miller's oven didn't. Ethan walked past it one evening after closing. He stood on the sidewalk and looked through the large glass window at the people inside. Young couples. Families. Office workers with laptops. A line that stretched almost to the door even at 7 in the evening. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to Miller's oven, sat down on the step outside the front door, and put his head in his hands. He wasn't angry at Sunrise Bakes. That wasn't what he felt. You can't be angry at progress. You can't be angry at people for choosing something new and shiny when new and shiny is right in front of them. What he felt was something more honest than anger. He felt afraid. The specific, cold, sinking fear of someone who is watching the ground shift beneath them and has no idea how to find solid footing. How do you compete with that? He was 20 years old. He had no marketing budget. No design skills. No professional equipment. The display case in Miller's oven had a crack in the corner that his father had fixed with electrical tape 3 years ago and never replaced. The sign outside was hand-painted by a neighbor who had done it as a favor in exchange for 24 biscuits. How do you compete with exposed brick and a loyalty app when you're working with an apron that belonged to your father and a recipe your grandmother invented in a small East Texas kitchen 50 years ago? The answer, for a while, was that he couldn't. And the numbers showed it. By the end of the first month, revenue was down almost 40% from what the bakery had been bringing in before Robert's accident. That was already a number that had been barely enough. 40% below barely enough put them in a place that had an official name on financial documents. It was called delinquent. It was called past due. It was called the kind of situation where envelopes start arriving with bold red text on the outside and you learn to recognize them without opening them. Ethan started doing things he'd never had to do before. He started tracking every single expense in a small notebook he kept in his apron pocket. He renegotiated the delivery schedule with their butter supplier to push payments back 2 weeks. He cut his own small weekly allowance in half. He turned the heat down in the bakery to save on the utility bill and worked in the cold some mornings with an extra layer under his shirt. He called his father every evening to check in. Robert would ask how the day went and Ethan would say, "Fine," or "Steady," or "A little slow but we're okay." None of which were entirely true, but none of which were entirely lies either. He didn't want his father worrying in a recovery bed. He didn't want the man who had poured 20 years into this place to lie awake at night feeling responsible for what was happening. So Ethan carried it. Quietly. The way his father had always carried things. The way working-class people often carry things. Without ceremony, without complaint, because there is no one else to hand it to and the job still needs to get done. His mother knew. Mothers always know. Patricia would watch him at the kitchen table at night, bent over his notebook, chewing the end of his pen, and she would set a cup of tea next to him without saying anything. Sometimes she'd sit across from him and they'd be quiet together for a while. One night she said, softly, "You're doing everything right, baby. Sometimes doing everything right just takes longer than we want it to." He didn't say anything back. But he held on to that sentence like a rope. The weeks kept passing. November came. The weather in Houston turned cool, and the warm smell of biscuits should have been drawing people in off the street like it always had in the fall. But the walk-ins stayed sparse. The regulars stayed loyal but small in number. And Ethan kept doing the math every night in that notebook and kept coming up just short. He started thinking about things he didn't want to think about. Whether the bakery could survive. Whether his father would come back to an empty space when his arm healed. Whether 20 years of Robert Miller's early mornings and sore feet and flour-covered hands would end not because he failed, but simply because the world around him had changed faster than he could keep up with. There were mornings when Ethan stood at the counter before opening, looking at the glass display case, and felt something close to giving up. Not the dramatic kind of giving up that happens all at once. The slow kind. The kind that creeps in quietly and starts telling you reasonable-sounding things. It whispers that maybe you've done enough. Maybe you tried. Maybe some things just don't work out, and accepting that isn't weakness, it's just reality. He was close to listening to that voice. And then the door opened. It was a Thursday afternoon in late November. The bakery was quiet. Ethan was restocking the display case with the last of the morning's cinnamon rusk when he heard the bell above the door jingle. He looked up expecting Miss Clara or maybe one of the construction guys stopping in late. It was a woman he had never seen before. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in work clothes, a little rushed in the way that people are when they're trying to fit one more errand into an already full day. She looked around the bakery for a moment, at the hand-painted menu, the display case, the old photographs of Houston that Robert had hung on the walls years ago, and something in her expression settled. Like she'd found something she wasn't sure she was looking for. She walked up to the counter. "Do you make birthday cakes?" she asked. Ethan paused. Birthday cakes were not on the menu. Had never been on the menu. Miller's oven did not make birthday cakes. He started to say that, the polite and honest answer, the easy answer. But he stopped. He looked at this woman. He looked at the near-empty display case. He thought about the notebook in his apron pocket and the numbers he'd written in it last night. And instead of saying no, he said something he hadn't planned to say. He said, "Tell me about the birthday." Her name was Diane. And the birthday was for her son, Marcus, who was turning 9 years old in 4 days. She hadn't planned to stop at Miller's oven. She'd driven past it 100 times without thinking twice. But Sunrise Bakes had told her their custom cake orders needed at least 2 weeks' notice, and she'd run out of time, and someone at her office had mentioned the little bakery on this street, and so here she was. A little desperate. A little hopeful. holding her car keys in one hand and her phone in the other. Ethan leaned on the counter and he listened. Really listened. Not the kind of listening where you're just waiting for enough information to say yes or no. The kind of listening his father had always done with customers, where you're trying to understand not just what they want, but what they actually need. Diane talked about Marcus. About how he was obsessed with space. About how he'd spent the entire past year drawing rockets and planets in every notebook he owned. About how this birthday was a big one for her, personally, because last year had been hard. She didn't say how exactly, and Ethan didn't ask, and she wanted this birthday to feel special in a way that made up for some of the hard. She wanted something that felt real, she said. Not just a pretty cake from a bakery with a chalkboard menu. Something that felt like it came from a person who actually cared about what it meant. Ethan was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I can do that." He said it before he fully knew how. He said it because something in him recognized what she was describing, that need to give someone you love a moment they would remember, and that recognition was louder than his uncertainty. He pulled out his notebook. Not the financial one. A different one he kept under the counter, filled with ideas he'd been scribbling down during slow afternoons. Recipe variations. Decoration concepts he'd seen in videos and thought about trying. Things he'd been teaching himself in the quiet hours when the bakery had no customers and he needed something to do besides worry. He sketched out a rough idea while Diane watched. A 2-layer vanilla cake. He was confident in his vanilla. His grandmother's base recipe was solid, with a dark navy frosting to represent the night sky. White and silver stars piped across the surface. A small fondant rocket he would figure out how to make by watching tutorials tonight. Marcus's name in bright yellow letters across the top. Diane looked at the sketch. Then she looked at Ethan. "How much?" she asked. He named a price. It was fair, not cheap, not gouging. Just fair. The kind of price that said this is real work done by a real person who is going to care about what they make for you. She paid a deposit, left her number, and walked out the door. And Ethan stood behind the counter for a long moment, staring at the sketch in his notebook, realizing that he had just committed to something he had never technically done before in a professional capacity, with 4 days to figure it out, for a child whose mother was counting on him to make a memory. He closed the bakery that evening and he got to work. He watched videos until midnight. Fondant technique. Piping stars. How to get a smooth navy frosting without it looking streaky. He practiced on a small test cake using the last of his available supplies. Frosted it, hated it, scraped it, and tried again. His mother came into the kitchen at 11:30 to tell him to sleep, and he said he would in an hour, and she looked at his hands, covered in dark blue frosting, and just nodded and went back to bed. He called his father the next morning. Not to tell him he was struggling. To ask him a specific question about the vanilla base, whether to use buttermilk or regular milk for the texture he wanted. Robert answered immediately, voice still rough with sleep, and walked him through it with the kind of quiet authority that 20 years of baking gives a man. Before they hung up, Robert said, "What are you making it for?" And Ethan said, "A birthday. For a 9-year-old who loves space." There was a pause on the line. Then his father said, "Make it like it matters." And Ethan said, "I know, Dad." He made it like it mattered. But somewhere in the second day of preparation, while he was sitting at the counter during a slow afternoon, something happened inside Ethan's mind. A thought arrived that was different from the ones he'd been having. Not a worried thought. Not a desperate thought. A creative one. He started thinking about what Diane had said, about wanting something real, something that felt like it came from a person who cared. And he thought, what if the cake wasn't the whole thing? What if the cake was just the beginning of the experience? He texted Diane. He asked her if she would be willing to send him a few photos of Marcus. Candid ones. The kid doing things he loved. Looking at the sky. Drawing his rockets. Just everyday moments that a mother would have on her phone the way all mothers do. Diane texted back in about 10 minutes. She said that was a strange request, but okay. And then she started sending photos. Ethan stayed up late that night doing something he'd never done before in any professional context. He opened a free video editing app on his laptop. He arranged the photos into a sequence. He found a piece of instrumental music, soft and wide and a little cinematic, The kind that sounds like it belongs in a movie about someone becoming who they're supposed to be. He edited the photos to the music carefully, each one timed to a beat, building gently toward the last image. Marcus standing in the backyard looking up at the night sky with his arms at his sides, face tilted upward, like he was having a conversation with the stars. He added a simple title at the beginning. It just said, "Happy birthday, Marcus. You were made for big things." He watched the finished video 3 times. The third time, he had to stop for a second and collect himself. Because it was good. Not just technically good. Emotionally good. The kind of thing that reminds you that ordinary moments, when someone takes the time to honor them, become something else entirely. Then he had another idea. He printed a small QR code. The code linked directly to the video, which he uploaded to an unlisted link so only people at the party could access it. He placed the QR code on a small card inside the cake box, beneath a note that read, "Before you cut the cake, scan this. Happy birthday, Marcus." From Miller's Oven. The cake itself came out better than he had expected. The navy frosting was smooth and deep. The piped stars caught the light in a way that actually looked like the night sky if you tilted your head slightly and let yourself believe it. The fondant rocket, which had taken him 4 attempts and a lot of colorful language to get right, sat at the top of the cake at a slight angle, like it had just launched. He photographed it before boxing it up. Not for social media. Just for himself. Because he wanted to remember what it looked like. The first one. He drove it to Diane's address the morning of the party. She opened the door and looked at the box and then looked at him and said, "Can I see it?" He opened the box on her doorstep. She put one hand over her mouth. She said, very quietly, "Oh, this is beautiful." Then she noticed the card with the QR code and he explained what it was and her eyes changed in the way that eyes do when someone realizes they've received more than they expected. She thanked him. He told her he hoped Marcus had a wonderful birthday. He drove back to the bakery. And he waited. He told himself not to expect anything. He'd done something nice. He'd made a good cake. Maybe the family would enjoy it and that would be the end of it. He'd gotten paid fairly and the experience had taught him something. That was enough. But something in his chest was doing a thing that felt unfamiliar. Not anxiety. Something else. Something that felt almost like the beginning of a plan. His phone buzzed at 2:17 that afternoon. It was Diane. The text said, "The video just played at the party. I need you to know, grown adults are crying in my living room right now. My sister wants to book you for her daughter's quinceañera. My neighbor wants to know if you do retirement parties. 3 people have asked me for your number. Please tell me you have availability." Ethan read the text once. Then he read it again. He set the phone down on the counter. He looked up at the ceiling of the bakery, at the water stain near the light fixture his father had been meaning to fix for 2 years, at the old photographs on the walls, at the cracked corner of the display case with the electrical tape. He picked the phone back up. He started typing.
There is a moment in every struggling person's story where the tide doesn't just turn. It turns because of something they did. Not luck. Not coincidence. Not someone reaching down from a comfortable place to pull them up. It turns because in the middle of exhaustion and fear and very real reasons to quit, they made one small creative decision that changed the entire direction of everything. For Ethan Miller, that decision was a QR code inside a cake box. But let's be honest about what that QR code actually was. It wasn't a marketing gimmick. It wasn't a social media trick he'd read about in some business article. It was something far more human than that. It was a 20-year-old kid who had grown up in a bakery listening to his father say that people don't just eat food. They eat the feeling that comes with it. And when the moment came, when the door opened and the opportunity walk in wearing work clothes and carrying car keys, he didn't just follow the recipe. He asked a deeper question. He asked, what does this person actually need? And then he figured out how to give them more of it than they knew to ask for. That is not a marketing strategy. That is character. And character, when applied consistently, becomes a business model. His phone didn't stop buzzing that Saturday afternoon. Diane had shared his number freely, the way people share things that feel too good to keep to themselves. By evening, Ethan had 6 inquiries. A quinceañera. A retirement party. A baby shower. A couple asking about a small wedding anniversary celebration. A woman who wanted a birthday cake for her mother who was turning 70 and had recently lost her husband, and who said, And Ethan would remember these exact words. I don't just want a cake. I want her to feel like her life has mattered. Can you do something like that? He typed back, yes. Tell me about her life. He stayed up until 3 in the morning responding to messages, sketching ideas in his notebook, building a simple order form on his phone's notes app, because he didn't have a website yet. He didn't sleep much. But the tiredness he felt that night was a completely different kind than the tiredness he'd been carrying for weeks. That previous exhaustion had been the weight of losing. This was the tiredness of building. And those two things, though they can look the same from the outside, feel entirely different from the inside. Monday morning he opened the bakery at 4:30 as usual. But something was different. He moved through the space differently. He looked at it differently. Not as a place that was failing to compete with exposed brick and chalkboard menus, but as something that had an advantage those places would never be able to buy: a history, a family, a story, and a young man who had learned from his father that the most important ingredient in anything you make for someone is the intention behind it. He made biscuits. He made cinnamon rolls. And in the back, while the ovens were running, he began building what he would later simply call the memory package. The concept was straightforward, because the best ideas always are. For any custom order, birthday, anniversary, graduation, retirement, quinceañera, baby shower, any milestone moment, the customer could request the memory package as an add-on. They would share photos with Ethan. Candid ones. Real ones. The kind that live in phone camera rolls and never get printed. Never get seen by anyone except the person who took them. Ethan would build a short personalized video from those photos, set to music chosen specifically for the mood of the occasion, with a simple title card that honored the person being celebrated. The video would be accessible via a QR code placed inside the box. The cake or baked item would be crafted to reflect something specific about the person: their favorite color, their hobby, their story. You weren't ordering a cake from Miller's oven. You were ordering a moment. A memory, packaged and delivered to your door, that would make people at a party stop what they were doing and feel something real. He priced it carefully. The memory package add-on was $45 on top of the base item cost. Not cheap for a working-class family, but not out of reach either. And the moment people experienced what $45 bought them, the tears, the laughter, the aunts grabbing their phones to show someone across the room, the birthday child watching a slideshow of their own life and realizing that someone who didn't even know them had cared enough to make it beautiful, the price stopped feeling like a cost and started feeling like an investment. Word moved through Houston neighborhoods the way word always moves: person to person, table to table, text to text. Someone experienced it at a party and told 3 people. Those 3 people told their families. A woman posted about it on a neighborhood Facebook group without even being asked, just because she wanted to. Just because it had made her cry in the good way at her father's retirement party, and she felt like people needed to know that this place existed. The post got shared 47 times in a weekend. Ethan didn't have an Instagram account for the bakery yet. He didn't have a website. He didn't have a logo redesign or a new sign or pendant lighting or exposed brick. He had a cracked display case and a hand-painted sign and 2 ovens and a notebook full of ideas and a grandmother's recipe for vanilla cake that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. And he had something that Sunrise Bakes, for all its beautiful photographs and loyalty apps, could not manufacture. He had authenticity. The unpolished, lived-in, deeply felt authenticity of a family that had poured itself into a 400-square-foot space on a quiet Houston street for 2 decades. You can renovate a building to look authentic. You cannot fake 20 years of early mornings and sore feet and love baked into every batch. People tasted the difference. And once they did, they came back. The regulars who had drifted away started drifting back. Not all of them, but enough. Miss Clara brought her granddaughter one Saturday morning and pointed at Ethan behind the counter and said, "That young man right there, his grandfather's recipes are in everything he makes." Ethan gently corrected her. It was his grandmother's recipes, actually, and Miss Clara waved her hand and said that was even better. December arrived, and with it a holiday rush that small bakeries either survive or don't. Ethan had spent November building his process. He'd created a simple intake system for memory package orders, so he could manage multiple requests, without losing the personal touch. He'd taught himself enough video editing that what used to take him 3 hours now took him 45 minutes. He'd found a reliable supplier for cake supplies that gave him a small discount for consistent orders. He'd hired a neighbor's teenage daughter to help with counter service on weekends for a fair hourly wage, which freed him to focus on the custom work in the back. He kept his notebook. Every evening, without fail, he sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the day. Revenue in. Expenses out. What went well? What needed to improve? The same discipline his father had practiced, updated for the new direction the bakery was heading. Small daily habits, sustained consistently over time. That's what recovery looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic single moment of triumph. Just a quiet accumulation of better decisions, made one day at a time. Robert Miller came back to the bakery in late December, 6 weeks after his surgery, 2 weeks ahead of the doctor's original estimate. His arm was still in a support brace. He walked through the door on a Tuesday morning before opening and stood in the space for a long moment, looking around. Ethan watched him from behind the counter, trying to read his father's expression. There were some new things. A small printed sign near the register explaining the memory package. A corkboard on the wall where Ethan had pinned thank you notes from customers. Actual handwritten notes, because people had started sending them. A whiteboard with a week's custom orders written out in Ethan's handwriting. The display case still had the cracked corner with the electrical tape. Some things take time. Robert walked slowly to the corkboard. He read a few of the notes. He stood there for a while without speaking. Then he turned around and looked at his son. And his expression was the kind that doesn't translate well into words. It was the expression of a man who had built something, and then watched someone he loved take it and carry it further than he'd been able to carry it himself. Pride. Gratitude. Something that sat beneath both of those things and didn't have a clean name. He said, "You kept it open." Ethan said, "We kept it open." Robert nodded. He walked behind the counter. He picked up an apron with his good arm, and struggled with it a little, and Ethan reached over to help him tee it. They stood there together in that narrow kitchen, father and son, in the bakery that had almost become just another closed storefront on a quiet Houston street. Then Robert looked at the ovens and said, "All right, let's make some biscuits." And they did. By the following spring, Miller's oven was operating at the highest revenue it had seen in its entire 20-year history. Not because Ethan had copied Sunrise Bakes. Not because he had chased trends, or overhauled the brand, or done anything that required a large investment he didn't have. But because he had gone deeper into what his family had always done, rather than sideways toward what competitors were doing. He had understood that in a world full of options, people will always find their way back to something that makes them feel genuinely seen. He had taken a simple product and added meaning to it. He had understood, the way his grandmother had tried to tell his father, and his father had spent 20 years trying to show him, that the real thing you are selling is never the thing you are selling. It is the feeling. It is the memory. It is the moment at a birthday party when a video plays and a room full of adults goes quiet and a 9-year-old boy watches his own small life appear on a screen. Set to music, honored by a stranger who took the time to care, and realize, maybe for the first time, that his life is worth celebrating. That is what Miller's oven sells now. And here is what Ethan Miller wants you to take from his story. If you are sitting somewhere right now with a small thing that you've built, or a dream you haven't finished, or a business that is barely holding on, or a moment where the voice of reasonable surrender is starting to sound almost logical, he wants you to know that he never had more resources than you probably have right now. He had flour and butter and 2 ovens and a cracked display case. He had a father's broken arm, and a notebook and a borrowed idea from a grandmother who never went to culinary school. He had fear and exhaustion, and a very real number of good reasons to walk away. What he also had was the willingness to ask one question, at exactly the right moment, when a stranger walked through the door. Not "Can I help you?" Every business asks that. But something deeper. Something that required him to actually care about the answer. He asked, "Tell me about the birthday." And in that question, in that choice to lean in rather than turn away, to offer more rather than give the easy no, to see a person rather than a transaction, was the entire blueprint of everything that came after. You don't need a bigger space. You don't need a better location. You don't need the loyalty app, or the pendant lighting, or the chalkboard menu. You need to find the thing that you do that no one else does quite the way you do it, and then go further into it than you think you need to. You need to stop selling the product, and start selling the feeling. Because at the end of the day, people forget the price. They forget the packaging. They forget the storefront and the sign and the aesthetic. But they never forget how you made them feel. That light still comes on at Miller's oven every morning at 4:30. Only now, 2 people tie their aprons in that small kitchen before the city wakes up. And some mornings, when the ovens are warming and the smell of biscuits is beginning to fill the space, Robert Miller looks at his son and thinks about his own mother, standing in a small East Texas kitchen 50 years ago, telling a young boy something that would take 3 generations to fully understand. People don't just eat food, she said. They eat the feeling that comes with it. She was right. She was always right. She just didn't know that one day, a 20-year-old kid in Houston would figure out how to put that feeling in a box with a QR code and save everything his family had built. Miller's oven. Still open. Still baking. Still making memories. One order at a time.